Gaming Bolt presents 15 biggest fails Nintendo wants you to forget. To slightly alter a quote from the recently released Breath of the Wild, the history of Nintendo is also the history of the video game industry. They were here in the dark days. They were here when the console market boomed. They were here when the handheld market was pioneered. They were here for the HD era, and they are here even now. And for that to have happened, for Nintendo to have been a constant, significant fixture in the market for so long, they'd have had to have done something right. A lot, actually, and there's no denying that's exactly what they've done. But they've also made mistakes. A whole shitload of them, if we're being honest. There's two sides to every coin, and while Nintendo have been at the forefront of countless revolutions and changes in the industry, they've also royally messed up a number of occasions. Here in this feature, we're going to look at the 15 biggest fails in Nintendo's long and storied history. Virtual Boy. The 3DS was not the first time that Nintendo tried to play the stereoscopic 3D card. We're speaking, of course, of the Virtual Boy, which remains probably Nintendo's biggest failure in the hardware market to date. The Virtual Boy wanted to implement ideas that were simply not possible with the technology it had access to. People had to bend over and peer into the bulky goggles to look at the images, and the images themselves could only be produced in limited colors. The result, as you can imagine, weren't pretty, and the Virtual Boy is considered to this day an absolute failure. CDI Zelda games. The Legend of Zelda is one of the most well-respected, prestigious franchises in this industry. But nothing and no one is perfect. People like to conveniently forget that this ever happened, but Nintendo once made the mistake of licensing the Zelda property for other developers to work on for the Philips CDI. And they sucked. They sucked so much it hurts. Anecdotes and stories of how terrible these games were have become things of legend. And while we try with every fiber of our being to make ourselves forget that this ever happened, there is always that sinister voice in the back of our head that keeps telling us there's something even worse than Spirit Tracks in the Zelda franchise. Super Mario Bros. The movie. The Super Mario Bros. Movie is at the forefront of every argument that rightly says that movies based on video games have never been anything but terrible. You think the Resident Evil movies are bad? Wait till you watch this atrocity. It was unfunny, it had a weird science fiction setting, and it was full of moments that could make you cringe right out of your skin. If for some reason you're into all of that, go right ahead and watch the movie. If you value your time and your sanity, stay away from it. The PlayStation split. Back when the SNES was nearing the end of its life cycle, Nintendo partnered with Sony to make a disc-based peripheral for the system. They were tentatively calling it the PlayStation. However, after a falling out, Nintendo decided to break their contract with Sony, instead choosing to work on the disc-based CDI with Philips instead. In retaliation, Sony entered the video games market with the PlayStation. The rest, as they say, is history. This may have haunted Nintendo for years, decades even, but we, along with millions of other people, are glad that this happened. So, thanks for creating PlayStation, Nintendo. N64 cartridges. In spite of that, when it was time for Nintendo to make a proper follow-up to the SNES, they decided to stick with the cartridge format. The CD-ROM was the latest format on the market, and was what all of the game developers wanted. It was cheap, it had tons of memory, and you could basically make more elaborate, better-looking games and be able to sell a lot more of them. Nintendo didn't seem to care, and their decision to keep the N64 cartridge-based lost them a great deal of third-party support. Major third-party titles like Resident Evil and Metal Gear Solid were all exclusive to the PlayStation, helping it establish its dominance over Nintendo and in turn become a real force to be reckoned with in the market. And of course, there was the big one: losing Final Fantasy to PlayStation. Thanks to the fact that the PlayStation was disc-based while the N64 wasn't, Square Enix decided to switch allegiances, and the megaton, super successful franchise known as Final Fantasy went from being a Nintendo exclusive to being a PlayStation exclusive, something that was only changed with Final Fantasy XIII in 2010 when the series went multi-platform. The legacy of Final Fantasy VII is well known, and its commercial success and the critical acclaim that it received only served to highlight just how ridiculous Nintendo's decision to stick with cartridges was. N64DD. Nintendo did eventually give in to the demand for disc-based games, but not in the way you'd imagine. The N64DD was an add-on for the N64, a disk drive that could be attached to the bottom of the system. What's wrong with that, you might ask? Well, it supported a specific type of disc that you had to purchase from Nintendo and only had a capacity of 64 megabytes, which was kind of missing the point entirely. As if that wasn't enough, when the accessory launched, it supported only 10 N64 titles. Combine that with the fact that the marketing for the 64DD was nothing short of pathetic, and it's no big surprise that Nintendo decided to discontinue it just a few short months later. GBA-GAMECUBE link cable. Nintendo were really thinking ahead of their time when they came up with the concept for the link cable. Connectivity between a handheld and a home console is something that some would say even now hasn't been fully realized, and that was exactly the issue. The idea behind the link cable was great, but Nintendo's execution left a lot to be desired. It wasn't convenient to use, it often required people to spend excessive money on experiences that just weren't worth it, and Nintendo ultimately did not support it as much as they should have. In addition to that, it was emblematic of a much more significant issue, since in its earlier days, Nintendo focused on it at the expense of a true, proper online. Online gaming. But let's be honest here, Nintendo have never really been able to do online gaming properly. They squarely ignored it with their earlier consoles, and when systems like the Xbox 360 and the PS3 started to illustrate that consoles can actually do online gaming properly, Nintendo decided to go with the god-awful system known as friend codes, something they've stuck with for all of these years. Games like Mario Kart and Super Smash Bros. Often suffered due to poor netcodes, while simple acts of syncing across systems or across accounts has you jumping through an unbelievable amount of hoops. It's incredible that Nintendo can't do online properly even in today's day and age. Dropping support for the Wii prematurely. The Wii, despite having sold much more than its competition, had a relatively short life cycle. Nintendo, however, did not even support the system for that complete period of time. 2010 was really the last year that the Wii saw proper support from Nintendo, with releases of games like Super Mario Galaxy 2 and Donkey Kong Country Returns, but after that, other than a few major releases such as The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, it was as if Nintendo had simply stopped trying. It was partly for that reason that they had to come up with a successor so urgently, which incidentally brings us to our next point. Wii U. We could write a detailed dissertation on everything that was wrong with the Wii U. There's just so much to talk about. But perhaps the thing that hurt the console more than anything else was Nintendo's terrible marketing of the system. Other than a very concentrated audience, the vast majority of people thought the Wii U was nothing more than an accessory. That vast majority was even bigger than it normally would be, owing to the fact that the Wii's target audience hadn't been the hardcore gamers to begin with. The fact that Nintendo's support of the Wii U was hilariously short-lived and not nearly as impressive as it should have been is also something that shouldn't be forgotten, and taking all of this into an account, it really is no surprise that the Wii U is the least successful console Nintendo have ever made. Nintendo 3DS launch. It was the 3DS that kept Nintendo afloat during the years of the Wii U, but even that beloved handheld system didn't have a very good launch, and we're putting that mildly. It had next to no interesting games on it for the first few months, and there was very little evidence to suggest that glasses-free 3D was anything but a gimmick, and in retrospect, it turns out that it absolutely was a gimmick. What didn't help was the fact that Nintendo launched the system at a price point of $250, an amount that people just weren't willing to spend on a handheld system. Coming off the back of the massively successful DS, the launch of the 3DS was quite a mess. That said, credit has to be given to Nintendo for managing to completely turn it around and turn the 3DS into the beast that it is today. Region locking. For some reason, Nintendo thought it would be a good idea to have region locking in a handheld in 2011. Sure, region locking was a common practice once, but it's become a thing of the past now. But apparently, Nintendo didn't get that memo. The 3DS and the Wii U both had region locking, something that both systems received a lot of flack for. We have to be thankful for the fact that the Switch has become the first Nintendo system ever to not have region locking, but seriously, why did this take so long? Stock shortages. The stock shortages of the Switch all across the world are well known to anyone who's trying to get their hands on the system, but Nintendo have been notorious for this for as long as we can remember. The N64, the Wii, the DS have all been victims to stock shortages, and more recently, that's even been an issue with the new 3DS. Even back during the days of the NES era, Nintendo had trouble keeping up with production on NES cartridges, while even today they cannot keep up with the demand for several Amiibo products. Some would say it's a good problem to have, but after 30 years in the industry, the question has to be asked, just when are you going to learn Nintendo? Not localizing popular games. Fatal Frame, Mother 3, Sin and Punishment, and so many of the earlier Fire Emblem games are just a few examples of Nintendo not treating their Western audiences quite as well as they should. These were all major releases, and despite great demand from audiences in the West, Nintendo has still not brought these games over from Japan. Hell, the demand for Mother 3 has almost become a meme at this point. Seriously, Nintendo, we want Mother 3. And that'll be about it for this one. If you guys like what we're doing at Gaming Vault, please consider subscribing to our channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.